Al Capone wasn't just a gangster. He was a businessman operating in one of the most profitable industries in American history, an industry created not by free market competition, but by government policy. Prohibition didn't just outlaw alcohol. It manufactured a market, erased legal competition, and handed the supply chain to whoever was bold enough to take it. That market turned ordinary criminals into multimillionaires, corrupted entire cities, and proved a timeless rule of economics. When lawmakers ignore demand, someone else will supply it. When the 18th Amendment came into effect in 1920, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, the United States government sold it as a moral crusade. Alcohol, they said, was the source of crime, poverty, and domestic abuse. Eliminate it, and society would clean itself up. But this was a political promise, not an economic calculation. The demand for alcohol didn't vanish overnight. In fact, in many places, it grew. And where there is demand with no legal supply, the price rises. That gap, the one between law and reality, was where Al Capone built his empire. Capone was born in 1899 in Brooklyn to poor Italian immigrants. By his early 20s, he was already embedded in organized crime. But Chicago during Prohibition wasn't exactly just a city of opportunity. It was the epicenter of an economic revolution in the underworld. Liquor wasn't just a vice, it was the new oil, and Capone, with his talent for organization, connections, and ruthlessness, was perfectly positioned to dominate it. His operation wasn't a ragtag gang selling bottles in back alleys. It was a vertically integrated enterprise that would make a corporate strategist proud. Capone controlled breweries, distilleries, import routes, and distribution networks. His product flowed into hundreds of speakeasies, underground bars disguised as soda shops, nightclubs, or backrooms, each paying for the privilege of access to a steady supply. His organization earned an estimated $100 million a year in 1920s dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $1.5 billion today. Capone wasn't just making money, he was laundering it. The profits from bootlegging were illegal, but Capone understood the importance of legitimacy. He invested in restaurants, nightclubs, and other cash-heavy businesses, which both masked the origins of his wealth and gave his criminal empire a public face. Bribes ensured protection from law enforcement. Politicians looked the other way. In a city where Prohibition had turned half the economy underground, Capone wasn't an outlaw. He was an employer, a patron, and in some circles, a local hero. The key to his success wasn't just violence, though he used it when necessary, but management of risk. He understood that Prohibition was both his opportunity and his vulnerability. His profits existed because the product was illegal. The day it became legal again, the margins would vanish. So he diversified. Gambling, prostitution, and other rackets became part of the portfolio. But alcohol remained the cornerstone because the economics were unmatched. Here's what made it so powerful. Before Prohibition, alcohol was a low-margin commodity. Beer was cheap, wine was accessible, and whiskey was affordable. But once outlawed, every risk in the supply chain added a markup. Bribes for police, payments to drivers, fees to middlemen. The price of liquor skyrocketed, and consumers still paid. Demand wasn't elastic. Alcohol was woven into social life, culture, and tradition. And the people willing to meet that demand controlled a product with government-created scarcity. Capone saw what lawmakers didn't. Prohibition wasn't stopping crime. It was industrializing it. Capone's empire worked because it was designed like a corporation, only without the limitations of legality. His business model had all the elements of a modern enterprise: vertical integration, market control, supply chain security, brand reputation, and an unbeatable distribution network. And the economics were extraordinary because the market was artificially constrained. Every barrel of beer, every bottle of whiskey was a premium product, not because of quality, but because of risk. But Prohibition also created something else, a financial ecosystem of corruption. Capone's money didn't just flow to gangsters, it flowed to police officers, judges, city officials, and even federal agents. Corruption wasn't a side effect, it was the operating system. When the legal system becomes dependent on illicit money, enforcement is never truly about law, it becomes about price. By the late 1920s, Capone's reach was so extensive that Chicago politics and organized crime were essentially two sides of the same coin. Businesses thrived or failed depending on their connections to the outfit. Rival gangs tried to muscle in on distribution, leading to turf wars like the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929. Violence was the visible part of the empire, but it was not the foundation. The foundation was finance, and Capone's control over that finance was what made him untouchable for so long. Yet power built on policy is always vulnerable to policy change. By the early 1930s, public opinion was shifting. The Great Depression had changed the political calculus. Tax revenues from legal alcohol were suddenly far more appealing than the moral arguments for prohibition. And for the federal government, the fact that Capone had become a national symbol of lawlessness made him the perfect target. They couldn't convict him for bootlegging. His empire was too well insulated, his operations too protected. But they could go after something else: taxes. In 1931, the government convicted Capone of income tax evasion, sentencing him to 11 years in federal prison. His downfall wasn't a dramatic shootout or a rival gang, it was paperwork. By 1933, prohibition was repealed. The market that had made Capone a billionaire evaporated overnight. Legal breweries and distilleries returned, prices normalized. The liquor trade went from a black market monopoly to a regulated industry. And just like that, one of the largest criminal economies in American history became taxable revenue. But here's the lesson. Prohibition didn't fail because crime was too strong. It failed because the economics were too powerful. Demand didn't care about the law. Supply adapted, and the profits were too large to suppress. Fast forward to today, and the mechanics haven't changed. Look at cannabis legalization. For decades, marijuana was a multi-billion-dollar underground market. Enforcement never eliminated it. It simply funneled money into the hands of those willing to take the risk. Now, as legalization spreads, the profits shift to corporations, taxes flow to governments, and the market consolidates. The economics are identical to prohibition, only the product is different. Or look at cryptocurrency. For years, it existed in a regulatory gray zone outside traditional finance. It attracted early adopters, risk takers, and opportunists. Enforcement agencies were behind the curve. Profits were massive. But as regulation closes in, the industry is consolidating, institutional players are moving in, and the wild margins of the early days are shrinking. The same dynamic is visible in industries shaped by sanctions, energy policy, and environmental regulation. And when governments restrict or control supply, they don't erase markets, they redirect them. Someone always steps in to fill the gap, whether it's oil under sanctions, rare earth metals under export controls, or carbon credits under environmental regulation. The profit lies in understanding the gap between law and demand. That's the real takeaway from Capone's story. It's not about crime, it's about the intersection of law, money, and opportunity. Capone's success was built on spotting a structural inefficiency, a market artificially constrained by policy, and exploiting it. You don't have to run a criminal empire to understand that these inefficiencies still exist. They're everywhere. And the people who spot them early, legally or otherwise, are the ones who profit. So what's the modern financial lesson? First, markets are never purely free. They're shaped by policy, regulation, and enforcement. When those shift, money moves. Understanding those shifts is a form of financial education. Second, scarcity creates opportunity. Whether that scarcity is natural or artificial, it changes price, demand, and profit margins. Recognizing artificial scarcity, created by law, by licensing, by regulation, is how smart players position themselves ahead of the curve. Third, policy-driven markets have built-in volatility. Just as prohibition ended overnight, so can today's profitable restrictions. If your wealth depends entirely on a legal gap, that wealth is temporary. Diversification is survival. Capone's empire rose because he understood his environment better than almost anyone else. It fell because the environment changed and he couldn't adapt fast enough. The same is true for every investor, entrepreneur, and policymaker today. Prohibition ended. Capone went to prison. But the cycle of policy, scarcity, and profit never stopped. It's still running. In cannabis, in crypto, in commodities, in every sector where demand outpaces legal supply. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it'll crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.